Okay, today we are going to learn how to answer the 3D question for Germany, which is a tricky one, but if we work together, it'll be brilliant. So, the question is, how far do you agree with the interpretation? And this is worth 16 marks. So the first level, to get 1 to 4 marks, is you need to do these 4 bullet points. So generally, you're given a bit of a comment, very limited analysis, not much detail, and just generally making facts about the period that the question's asking about. To get a level 2, you need to start thinking about evaluating the interpretations, which we'll come on to in a second. You've got some more detail this time, and you've got a bit more relevant own knowledge, but still, you're not developing your judgment. To get a level 3, you need to explain your evaluation, you need to have good analysis, your own knowledge now is supporting your evaluation, and you are now including a judgment with some justification, which means you're giving some reasons to support it. Your top ones will get you a mark of 13, 14, 15 or 16. This is where you've explained your evaluation, you've got lots of analysis, you've used relevant own knowledge, and you are justifying your judgment.
Okay, so when we're actually starting to answer the question, the first thing we need to really think about is putting forward and showing the examiner that we understand what the interpretation is saying about the standard of living for German workers in Nazi Germany. So here I've said I'm only going to partially agree with interpretation 1, and I'll reiterate the inquiry to show the examiner that I'm focused on that, because it is giving a negative view of living standards and implying that they deteriorated for everyone. Now, when we're talking about this, we need to think about using language which the examiner is going to be looking at. So words like implies is a really good one because it's showing us what the interpretation is kind of saying might be true. Then we need to talk about what the interpretation is saying and how it actually puts that across. Now, in the mark scheme, you'll remember that it talks about this idea of conveying. So it's also a really good thing to use the same kind of language which is in the mark scheme. So we need to show what the view is and how the interpretation is actually getting it across. So we've said that it's giving a negative view. So we need to say, well, what actually is it in the interpretation that kind of makes us think that it's a negative view? So we're saying that it says that despite a wage increase, the cost of living rose, which actually implies a drop in living standards. So even though it appears that living standards are getting better through a wage increase, actually the cost of living is dropping, which actually shows that it's quite negative. Then we need to be thinking about backing this up with our own knowledge. Okay, so it's a little bit like the Peel structure. So we've made our point that we agree, then we're using our evidence, and now we're explaining using own knowledge. So we're saying, I actually agree with this and what they're saying, because even though wages did improve for the majority of workers, the cost of most things rose alongside it. Then we're saying that interpretation also claims that there were food shortages. Okay, again, using the word convey, how are they actually kind of getting this across? Well, they're saying it's because the government reduced agricultural production. Again, we're saying, would we agree or disagree with it? This is essentially what evaluation is. How much do we agree with something? How much do we disagree with it? So we're saying that we agree with this interpretation because the government did reduce agricultural production. We know they did this because they wanted to keep prices higher for farmers. So this is going to lead to lower living standards because German workers couldn't access food easily. If it's more expensive for people to buy food and they're getting lower wages, obviously they're not going to be able to actually buy as much. The negative view of living standards put forward as interpretation can also be supported by other things not shown in the source. So what we're doing here is we're showing in the examiner that we have other own knowledge which we can bring with it. This is the idea of in level 4 when we have to use own knowledge to support the evaluation. So for example, we know that hours of working rose. We know that people would spend less time at home. We know there was a lack of workers' rights because the labour unions were banned and strikes were made illegal. And then we're linking it back to the question. So all of this is going to make me agree with the negative view of living standards showing interpretation 1 because we know that working conditions deteriorated and workers had no way of actually improving them. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that we're doing with any how far question, give 2 different viewpoints. So then we need to disagree with it. So we're going to say, actually, we disagree with the entirely negative tone in interpretation 1. And again, we're using words like tone because the examiner likes to have us comment on the tone of the interpretation. So by implying that living standards drop due to a rise in prices, it puts forward the view that everyone is worse off. Now, we don't think that this is actually true because the claim that everybody being worse off is probably quite far-fetched. So I would question the extent to which food shortages affected living standards because we know that although some products were difficult to come by, actually things like meat actually rose. So this disagreement is also shown in interpretation 2. Now in the interpretation questions, this is really important because even though the question is focusing on interpretation 1, you're not going to get many marks if you don't also talk about interpretation 2. So use the other interpretation to disagree with the first interpretation. So interpretation showing a different view. So again, what we're doing is we're talking about what the interpretation says and how it is conveyed. Okay, so it's saying interpretation 2 that for some workers, living standards actually rose. And it says that if you actually conform to Nazi expectation, your living standards went up. Basically implying that if you were a good Nazi, then life got better. Now we would agree to this to a certain extent because there were some benefits. We know about the Strength Through Joy program, which interpretation 2 talks about, and we know it provided benefits such as loans and medical care. We would also agree with it because we know that the Strength Through Joy program provided workers benefits. So again, we could use own knowledge, like 10 million people took holidays through the KDF, and we'd also talk about beauty of labour. Okay, again, this is additional own knowledge which isn't in the interpretation, which shows the examiners that we know what we're talking about. So they did things like building canteens, improving lightings and improving working conditions. But we also know that these benefits were limited because even though the beauty of labour did make these improvements, they were actually resented by workers because they were the ones having to do the improvements in their spare time. So it kind of supports interpretation 1 when it says improvements and living standards actually comes as a cost. So likewise, the KDF benefits were not always available to all due to the activities being expensive. So hopefully what you can see here is now we're starting to disagree with interpretation 2. So just like we did with interpretation 1, we're saying why we agree with it and also why we disagree with it. But despite these drawbacks, which would appear to support the negative effects shown in interpretation 1, they do show that they brought improvements to some people, which would lead me to agree with the tone in interpretation 2. So what we're doing constantly is we are linking back to the question and talking about why we agree with one interpretation or the other. So what we've done so far is we've agreed and we've disagreed with both interpretation, but to hit level 4 we have to give a justified judgment. So that means we have to say which one we agree with, but we have to give a reason why. So even though both interpretations show a valid viewpoint on the living standards of German workers, so we're linking it back to the inquiry again, I would agree more with interpretation 1. Okay, so now we need to say why. The claim in interpretation 2 that for Germans who conform to Nazi expectation living standards went up isn't true. From our own knowledge, we know that that statement is over-exaggerated and is not true. Even Germans who fully supported the Nazis faced the difficulties highlighted in interpretation 1. Even if you were the best Nazi in the world, you still had to do longer days, you'd still have a higher cost of living, and you'd still have food shortages. So despite some glimmers of benefit through the Strength Through Joy programme, the disadvantages faced by German workers meant that on the whole living standards dropped. And that fits more firmly with interpretation 1.
Okay, so we've opened up our paper and this is the question. How far do you agree with interpretation 1 about the standard of living for German workers in Nazi Germany? So the first thing when we get a question is we need to work out exactly what it's asking us to do. We need to make sure we look at how far we agree with interpretation 1. And the inquiry that we're looking at, the thing we want to focus on is the standard of living for German workers in Nazi Germany. Okay, so immediately we'll think of some own knowledge ideas for that in a second. So then we move over to our interpretations. So we've got interpretation 1 and interpretation 2. And remember, we're being asked how far do you agree with this one, interpretation 1, so bear that in mind as we go through. Okay, so the first interpretation is talking about life in Germany. So it says from 1936 to 1939, so we already know that is in the Nazi period, so that's good. Wages increased. This is to do with the standard of living, which will mean it's a good thing, so I'll put a tick there. But this was due to a longer working day rather than an increase in hourly wages. So it's saying there is an increase in living standards, but actually it's due to a longer working day. So not an improvement. In addition, the cost of living rose in the 1930s, which meant that real wages, how much workers could buy, actually fell. So again, on the surface, it looks like there's been an improvement in standard of living, but actually there's not. There was also food shortages because the government reduced agricultural production to keep up with the prices to help farmers. So again, having food shortages is not a good thing. So overall, the standard of living, we can see on the surface looks quite good, but actually it's not that high. Then we need to look at interpretation 2. This is the one we're thinking either about agreeing or disagreeing with in comparison to interpretation 1. So it says, for Germans who conformed to the Nazi expectations, living standards went up. So this is good, But again, we need to remember that actually it's not for all German workers, it's for those that conformed to the Nazi expectations. Unemployment dropped. Now this is a good thing, so we'll give that a tick. That definitely helps the standard of living. Nazi statistics show that real wages rose. Excellent. But only if a worker worked overtime. That supports what interpretation one's saying about actually on the surface is looking good, but realistically it's not. The Strength Through Joy programme provided many extras. We know that to be true. Some benefits, such as loans and medical care, weren't real enough. So again, we could say that that is an improvement for standard of living, but then we need to put our own knowledge to see whether we agree with that, which we'll do in the paragraph